Hello, everybody. My name's Ian Harris, and I have been asked to say a few words about those awful situations that everybody faces, and I mean everybody, when performing in a FRCR Part 2B VIVA. If I or Samir or anybody else was to appear with all the experience we have, we would encounter stages in the VIVA which we would find awkward and unpleasant because we are not sure about what's going on the film, or we feel we ought to be sure when we're not in a position to be sure in actual fact. So everybody in a VIVA is going to face certain difficulties. And I think it's very important you recognize that, because what I would say to you all is that in advance of the VIVA, you should expect during a whole hour's worth that there will be at least 3 or 4 times when things get a bit sticky and when you're stuck. If you anticipate that and expect that, then it might help you to use my troubleshooting video to think, right, what's the best way of getting out of this situation? If you are a good enough candidate and if you're ready for this exam, then I think these troubleshooting things may help you pass where you might otherwise react inappropriately to when you find yourself in those awkward situations. So I've tried to split it up into a number of sections. Firstly, when you go into the VIVA, you are going to be a little bit nervous and you're going to be a little bit butterfly-y. And I would say that in most situations, the examiners will try their very best and usually succeed in trying to put you at your ease. They are not there to be intimidatory. I don't think they would be in a held as examiners if they were. So they will try and put you in a position of ease. However, if you go into this exam knowledgeable, but without some sort of tactical approach, then instead of just being a bit butterfly-y, you will feel nervous and you'll feel stressed. As some of you may know, I often talk about technique in VIVAs, but this is not a talk about the technique, this is a talk about how you deal with the difficult situations in a VIVA. The only thing I would say as the overwhelming and overriding reason why most candidates feel extremely stressed rather than just appropriately nervous is because they think, completely mistakenly, that one is expected to get the diagnosis on the film, and I mean the diagnosis, not even the differential, but the diagnosis on the film, ASAP. This is a complete mistake. Cases evolve, and the diagnosis, or more accurately, the usual differential, unless it's a pathognomonic case, comes later in the day, in inverted commas. What you should be focusing on when the film first goes up is what are the significant and definite abnormality or abnormalities on that film. That should be your focus at the beginning. But if the moment the film goes up, you're thinking, what is this? It will create undue stress. And that is to be avoided, because it can make anybody say very, very silly and very inappropriate things. So, what are the situations? Well, I've sort of categorized it. So the first one I've put down on my list is when you have a mental blank. Mental blanks happen to everybody. If I took this exam now, I would for sure, particularly at my age, have a significant number of mental blanks. All I'll say about the mental blank is it will happen to almost everybody at some point in the VIVA. Just declare that you've had a mental blank. The examiners are quite savvy, and I think they can suss out if people have really had a mental blank rather than they're just saying it. In my experience, people don't often say it in a sort of fraudulent way, but the examiners will sort of sense from the way you have described things as to whether you really have had a mental blank or not. So if you genuinely have had a mental blank, you must not worry about it. The examiners perfectly understand that it's a bit stressful and that we all have mental blanks. So my main advice there is just don't worry, declare you've had a mental blank and get on with whatever the examiner then next asks or says or whatever. Okay? Now, this is the one that candidates fear probably the most, and there's different advice given from different people. Now, I am not bold enough to claim that my advice is correct and others wrong. All I can tell you is what I think that you should do and what I would do in this situation where I face an exam. And by the way, not seeing a definite and significant abnormality on a film will almost certainly happen to you at some point in the VIVA. As a fellow examiner, there are quite a number of films that I see over the years where I think, I can't really see a very obvious, significant and definite abnormality myself on this film. So the first thing to say about it is, don't worry if this occurs. If there's a film where you, with all your training and ability, can't see a significant and definite abnormality initially, probably 90% of other people, of other candidates, should I say, taking it can't, and probably a significant number of fellow examiners can't either, because obviously it's significant and definite, but it's subtle. So the first thing I do there is take more time than you normally would without talking, other than if you wish to say, I haven't seen a significant definite abnormality and I'm going through my review areas carefully. Now, the examiner might well then help you at that point and say something like, well, tell me what your review areas are. And then you might go through them. And then when you get to, well, I checked the bones, in particular the ribs, and then he might stop and say, well, what do you think about the ribs? Well, the moment he says that, he or she, by the way, says that, you immediately know that the problem is in the ribs. So concentrate on the ribs and don't feel in a hurry to find the abnormality of the ribs. Still take the time that you would normally take at the beginning of a film because you're now focusing on one part of the film. So don't immediately try to find the abnormality of the ribs because it's obviously subtle. But you at least have a clue as to what you need to look at. So my absolutely, indefatigable advice in this situation is, if you can't see a clear and significant and definite abnormality and you've taken enough time to look carefully in all the review areas of the film, say that to them. Just say, I've looked at the film carefully, I've looked at all the review areas, and I cannot see, and use this wording, a significant and definite abnormality, which means that you might have seen a little bit of arthritis in the fingers, but you don't deem it significant in this case, or not the reason why the film's gone up. If you say that, rather than clutching at straws and finding abnormalities that don't exist, you've nothing to retract, and I can almost give you a guaranteed promise that the examiner will then say something like, either, what are your review areas? And you go through them. And then he says, right, stop. What do you think about under the diaphragm? Or he will at that point, without saying what your review areas, say something like, what do you think about the configuration of those ribs? What do you think about the diaphragm? Do you think it looks normal? You know, something of that nature. They will draw your attention because they know from experience that whenever they show that film, 90% of other candidates don't see the abnormality either. So they recognize that the abnormality is quite subtle and that you may need a little bit of help from them. So that is my clear advice to you. Also, I'll just say one more thing about when you can't see a definite abnormality. It usually occurs in the chest and often occurs with abdominal films, usually plain films of chest or plain films of abdomen. With the chest, you should have a list of things in your head to look for when you can't see a clear abnormality on a chest x-ray in an exam. For example, I have sort of in my head that if as a fellow examiner, I'm shown, or the candidate is shown the film by the other examiner, and it's a chest x-ray, and I think I can't see anything obvious on this myself, let alone the candidate. There are certain things I look for, like dextrocardia, that's an easy one to miss. Coarctation with the rib notching. Pectus excavatum, those are the things you tend to have on chest x-rays that you can't see an abnormality because the abnormality is subtle. So I would have a little list in your head just in case you get the chest where you can't see the abnormality. With respect to the abdomen, all I would say to you is usually in abdomens, if the abnormality is subtle and you can't see a significant and definite abnormality on it, look at the bones carefully. There's usually a great chunk of the ileum missing, or there's a hemophilic pseudotumor of the ileum, or something like that, or a subtle dermoid. Don't start saying things like, oh, the bowel's very gassy or something like that as a sort of a clutching at straw thing. Okay? Now, the next point I've put down is when you're feeling you're getting a bad response from the examiner. Now, I've only put this down because this is what candidates say to me when I'm teaching them. They say, oh, or when they give feedback of when they had their last VIVA. You haven't a clue what the examiner's thinking, and I literally mean that. You haven't a clue. Examiners behave in various ways, and they have various manners, just like they do in human interaction. I'm sure we've all had the person where you think, oh, they're being a bit miserable to me, and then in actual fact, suddenly they're all nice and pleasant. So we can't predict and we can't interpret by people's mannerisms how you're doing. So why should you try? So you must ignore everything about the examiner other than the information they're giving you, and trying your best to interact with them in a way where they will help you. So if you start trying to interpret how you think you're doing by the examiner's response, likely as not, you'll be wrong for two reasons. Number one, as a fellow examiner, I have often misinterpreted from the reaction as to how my fellow examiner thinks a candidate is doing. So much so that they'll say afterwards, oh, didn't that candidate do well? And I thought from the reaction that they thought they were doing badly. And also, in general terms, this is almost always the case, not always. Usually, a candidate is doing much better than they actually think they're doing. Now, if in addition you try and use information by guesswork from the examiner's reactions, you may feel you're doing even more worse than you thought you were doing, even though actually you're doing fine. So my solid advice to you is do not try and second guess how the examiner thinks, how you think the examiner thinks you're doing. Okay? Now, when there are situations when the examiner keeps pressing you for an answer, and again, you've got to be a bit careful about not over-interpreting this in the sense that if you don't get the answer out, that's it, you've had it. Because examiners are often thinking this candidate's good, maybe they're really gold standard. So they may be pressing you, and okay, if you can't get the answer, you're not gold standard, but you're still easily passing the exam. And secondly, they just like to press you because obviously if by pressing you, they get a diagnosis like fluorosis or mastocytosis or some quite obscure diagnosis, they'll think, oh, this is, that's pretty good. Well done, sort of thing. It doesn't mean they're trying to press you because if you don't get the answer, that's it. Your differential was rubbish and you're doing badly. There may be occasions when there is something moderately basic that they're trying to extract from you, and we're all going to be prone to not getting every single basic answer that is expected from us. However, the poor candidate or the candidate that's not ready for the exam will struggle frequently on being pressed for fairly straightforward answers. Well, clearly they're not ready for the exam and they're not ready to pass the exam at that point. So if you're a decent or a half decent candidate, do not worry if there's an odd occasion where you feel you were pressed for a fairly basic sort of question and that you weren't able to give the answer, just carry on regardless and do your best. It is very unlikely in isolation to be a reason for failing. Okay? You may be pressed, and this often happens. People say to me, well, and these are people that sometimes have failed, sometimes have passed. They say, well, the examiner really pressed me about something like, what's the antibody test I look for in Hashimoto's thyroiditis? Well, if they are indeed asking you for information like that, it's highly likely that they think you're a very good candidate and they're just checking whether you might be gold standard. No one is going to fail or even do badly in this exam because they didn't know what antibodies are checked for in Hashimoto's thyroiditis. Now, I think these last bits of advice you've probably already discussed with various people, but just in case. There are times when Vivas go swimmingly well and you feel good and you're even half starting to enjoy it, and then all of a sudden there's a downturn and you get 2 or 3 cases on the trot that seem tough. The answer is that probably, unless you really, really have misinterpreted what's been going on before, you've probably already passed the Viva. And they're giving you tougher cases because they think, well, if I give them the bog standard cases, they're just going to make mincemeat of it. So they give you tougher cases. It's a completely natural reaction that almost all examiners do. And again, there's the possibility that you might be a gold standard candidate. So they'll do it for that reason as well. If you think things were going really, really well, and then all of a sudden you're struggling a bit and the cases seem tough, just carry on. Just use basic, sensible technique. You'll be fine. Okay? What about when things start badly? There's always this talk of giving warmer-upper cases, and I think that a lot of examiners give warm-up cases, so they'll give something relatively straightforward like left upper lobe collapse or something like that. Now, in all truth, if you can't handle a case like that, even if it's at the beginning of the exam, then in all truth, you're possibly not ready for the exam. But we're all a bit nervous at the beginning, and when you're nervous, you can make the most basic errors and get things wrong. So if that happens to you, and in fact you are a decent candidate, just carry on. You've got to just carry on. You have an hour to prove yourself. It's an awful long time to prove yourself. And I'm sure you've been told many, many times before, you can muck up so many cases and still pass the Viva. You have to be able to put the bad start behind you and carry on, because all of a sudden, cases 4, 5, 6, and 7, you just cream off. And then you're fine. And then all is forgiven at the beginning and put down to nerves. So if it starts badly, just force yourself to carry on, and remember, it does not at all mean that you cannot pass the Viva, and pass the Viva glowingly as well. Now, I'm often asked about when the case won't come down, what do you do? Well, the answer is there's no specific reason why cases don't come down. They want to show you complex cases in this exam. They want to see how you handle a complex case without necessarily getting the diagnosis, because in real life, you may get complex cases. What they want to see is that you can analyze the film well, that you can come up with a very, very reasonable, hopefully small differential, and that you know how to get to the diagnosis by further radiological and, very importantly, non-radiological tests and investigations. So they actually want to see, what do you do with a complex case where you can't possibly say what the diagnosis is? How do you help the clinicians get the answer? So the film might stay up quite a long time because it's a complex film. It's one of those films where they were challenged themselves when they first saw the film, and it might have taken 2 or 3 weeks to get the diagnosis and the steps they took and what it was that clinched it. So these films may stay up quite a while because they're testing your mettle. They're seeing, how would you deal? Now, you're under a stressful situation. You're in an exam situation. You've got 2 people sitting there watching you. They understand that, you're a bit nervy, and they may not immediately think, oh, well, I do X, Y, and Z. So the film may stay up. It doesn't mean you're doing badly. Or a film just stays up because you are doing badly. The point is, you don't know why the film's staying up. You've no idea. So don't worry about how long the film is staying up. That's not your responsibility or concern. That's in the examiner's control, and there's nothing you can do about it. All your job is to give sensible and reasonable analysis, comments, and suggestions of things you would do to try and work out from whatever differential there is, or from whatever process you think is going on, how you would get the answer by further tests, whether they be radiological or non-radiological, and do not concern yourself with how long the film is staying up. Okay? Right, to keep this brief, because I could go on for hours, I've just put one more criterion, which is when you're given an examination that you're not familiar with, like something like an ERCP or a perhaps a cardiac CT or something like that, that you may or may not have often seen. When something is shown that's fairly specialized or very specialized, I would go hurrah, because what I would do is I think this is bound to be or likely to be a fairly common clinical diagnosis, or something that you can work out because the anatomy is demonstrated clearly on this test, however unusual it is. So, for example, if you're given an ERCP, you see the biliary anatomy and the pancreatic anatomy clearly. So just analyze it, forgetting about the fact that you've never not reported many ERCPs. It's irrelevant. All you do is look at your biliary tree, analyze the anatomy, work out what's the cystic duct, work out what's right and left intrahepatic, work out where the pancreatic duct, if it does conjoin, if it comes out separately, etc., and just make all these observations as you would if it was a test that you were familiar with. And the likelihood is that the abnormality will be fairly obvious, and the likelihood is that the diagnosis may actually be a fairly straightforward one. And if it's not, the examiner will help you get there, so long as your observations are reasonable. Now, I'll leave it at that, and I hope that has been helpful, and good luck.